Dr. Roger here, Roger Giegwald. You know, I couldn't help thinking this morning, it comes to me every morning now, just after I wake up, that just as President Trump, Elon Musk, and the rest of the new Trump team have hatched very clever strategies to end the war in Ukraine, and I'm sure they'll do the same in Gaza, on the southern US border, and with all the other things that they have promised to deliver. I think they also have very clear designs on the United Kingdom. The UK is, of course, very close to Trump's heart, not least because he owns a major resort and property interest here, and his mother was Scottish. So, what keeps banging around in my head in the mornings, last few days, is my wondering if Elon and Donald decided that Nigel Farage was not the man to run Britain, and thus set out to replace him and possibly sideline his Reform Party, which was beginning to wipe the floor with the useless Conservative Party, which lost the last election to the Labour Party, which is in power now and is fast turning the UK into a socialist Muslim country, curtailing free speech and other rights in the process. Elon announced to the world that Farage wasn't right, a very bold action. He wasn't the right man, and someone named Rupert Lowe, a member of parliament, was. Lowe then moved on to denounce Farage and reform, and a large fight, a gigantic fight broke out, which now involves allegations of violent threats, threats of violence and bullying by Lowe, and even the police have been brought into it. And many reform supporters, they say, some media, as much as a third, are withdrawing from reform because of this infighting. They pretty much had 14 years of that and scandals and corruption with the previous conservative government. So it's just a thought. I mean, it's not even a theory, but I just wonder. Let's see if Rupert Lowe and another disgruntled ex-Reform Party guy, Ben Habib, actually form a new party with support from Trump and maybe even money and support from Musk. I don't know, but I've heard that mentioned as a possibility. And is this another clever Trump strategy? He always knocks you off guard first with something quite fantastic, and then, as he's done with the tariffs, and then comes in with a business-like proposal that you kind of have to accept. Today, I've got a great guest. Harry Robinson is a leading voice in the very popular quite white right-wing podcast called Lotus Eaters. Have a look at that. And he's a very vocal, a very intelligent, very articulate young man, and makes some great arguments for what is wrong with this country and how to fix it. So, Harry, welcome. Welcome to the Gospel According to Dr. Roger. You're a very well-known and rather controversial figure, and your famous Lotus Eaters podcast is itself notably controversial, especially as your partner Carl Benjamin leads it. So it's a pleasure to have you. You've been accused of all kinds of things, misogyny and hate and non-chronic hate, whatever.
Only by people who severely dislike us. So I try not to take their opinions too seriously. I hope
Right.
I'm not too controversial. I like to think that I'm just somebody who actually cares about the truth.
Okay. Okay. Well, there are people who would differ with you about whether you're speaking the truth or not. But if, on this program, that just, makes you a more interesting chap. And then our listeners, our viewers can decide for themselves whether you're crazy or whether, you have an insight that they haven't had yet. So let's get on with that. I understand from our producer that you want to speak about Ukraine, which is a subject that I'm broadcasting about all the time at the moment. And the monologue that I just did is from my weekly column for Sky News Australia, where I went, as we say in the States, balls out on the subject all the way. And of course, there are a lot of people who disagree with me as well. So, Harry, the UK has committed some 12.8 billion to Ukraine, 7.8 billion in military aid, and 5 billion in non-military support. That's a hell of a lot for a small country. When Labour came into power, of course, they claimed they had this inherited 22 billion pound black hole, and they even cut winter fuel payments to the elderly and the pensioners. And isn't that a bit too much? And should we really be spending money on a foreign country's war, which itself is kind of a questionable war at times in some people's mind? And should we be encouraging Ukraine to enter into peace negotiations with Russia as President Trump is doing?
Well, that's a big question. So let me try to tackle it point by point. So first off, yes, we have already committed a lot of money and resources to supporting the Ukrainian war effort. I think most recently, about 4 days ago, a new deal has been either agreed to or officially signed, where we're dedicating another 2.26 billion pounds in a new loan to them. So the Labour government is doing everything that it can right now to ensure that the support for Ukraine is continuing. And there is a certain support for that on the ground in the UK, but I would say that's only because of the perception of the war that most people have, which is that it's a just war. On the regards to the UK's actual ability to put that much money to them, I think it's a very foolish idea. As you mentioned, we had an enormous budgetary black hole that the Labour government inherited, at which point they immediately started doing things like slashing the winter fuel allowance. And the most controversial thing that's created a number of protests has been the inheritance tax changes, which are said to make up about £520 million per year in the budget. No, sorry, was it £52 million? No, I think it is about 520 million pounds per year in the budget, which is actually the exact same amount or thereabouts that we're sending in foreign aid to foreign farmers, and will run the NHS for maybe a couple of days. So the actual
And that,
ability.
if I can just interrupt, and that, of course, is if the 22 billion pound black hole was real or fictitious, like the Tories' 55 billion pound black hole a couple of years ago was completely fake.
Of course, it's always difficult to trust the government when they come up with these kinds of figures, because you and I have no real insight into what the government budget looks like right now. It's very opaque. And so they could just be saying it so that they can offload some of the blame for some of the terrible
No,
decisions that they make.
again, forgive me, but I wouldn't agree. I think we know very well. I mean, a number of think tanks came out when Bates Motel Hunt announced the 55 billion pound black hole, leading to the next day 25 billion pounds of stealth taxes. And the 30 billion of cuts that was to come never happened because they weren't needed, because it was fake. And these think tanks said that if Fishy Rishi and Bates Motel had only stuck to the way they had been calculating the national debt when Fishy was chancellor, we would have had a 15 billion pound surplus at the time, not a 55 billion pound black hole. And the same think tanks and many economists have already shown how the 22 billion pound black hole is as fake as many other things that Rachel Reeves is alleged to have said in her CV and elsewhere. She actually is an economist because she's so, it seems, economical with the truth.
Well, perhaps. I know that people have looked into her former claims on her CV and found that she might have been perhaps bending the truth a little bit on that. But I like your take on it, and thank you for correcting me on that. But I think on many metrics, the actual well-being of the people within the UK is getting worse and worse every single year. This is something that we talk about a lot on our podcast. I particularly have spoken a lot about the deteriorating state of towns in the UK. All you need to do is go to towns that even 10, 20 years ago were very, very nice, good places to live, and see that most of them are completely deprived now. The industry, the local businesses have shut down. So for most people, I think if they were to consider that, their well-being, their livelihoods are getting worse, their local surroundings are always getting worse, while we're sending off this money so that we can protect foreign borders, while at the same time our own government is more than happy to have a very lax border policy, it would be something that, which should be something that frustrates a lot of people. And I know it is something that does frustrate a lot of people. And then there's the moral question of the war of it in and of itself. Now, of course, I'm not going to be making any apologies for Russian aggression or anything like that, but we have to consider that these years later, Russia has captured a great deal of territory. It's captured most of the 5 oblasts that it was originally intending to get, still got full control of Crimea. Ukraine has gotten to the point now where they are swiping up men off of the streets and conscripting them into the war effort that way, because they're not getting people volunteering to sign up in the great numbers that they need. So the question is, has Ukraine lost this war? I would say yes.
Yeah, I think that happened probably long ago, lots of people would say. And isn't it interesting that we're pouring all this money, which we really need here, as you point out, for very serious things, but we're giving it away to strangers in a somewhat, I guess, questionable war, because otherwise Putin is going to show up on our doorstep. And isn't it interesting that he's never threatened the UK, really? There have been mentions of bombing London and things, but this was, propaganda and not really terribly serious. I mean, he's not going to invade the rest of Europe tomorrow. And yet at the same time, you've got all these people in the streets and in the media and everywhere else saying, how dare we give 1 cent to Israel to defend us when, in fact, Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and Islamic Jihad all come from a place saying, we're going to get rid of the Jews, and then the rest of you infidels are next. They will show up if they get given a chance. And yet we're not willing to fund that. I mean, that disparity really troubles me. And the disparity even bigger, that we won't even take care of our own citizens in the middle of a cost of living crisis, people who are starving, people who years on into this are still having to choose between eating and heating. And we're giving our money to a foreign war, as you say.
Yeah, on that, I do think that the war effort has been lost a long time ago, and it makes you wonder why it is that people within Europe, the European leaders, are still looking to support the effort as much as they are. There was the recent thing where a bunch of the European leaders, including Ursula von der Leyen, following Friday's recent controversy where Donald Trump had a bit of a go at Zelensky, all posted the same thing in support of Zelensky. The meetings that have been going on with Keir Starmer since then, all of this reaffirmation over and over again of our continuing support for Ukraine and Zelensky in particular, despite the fact that Donald Trump is trying to broker some kind of peace deal. Obviously, there was the controversy, there was the difficulties on Friday regarding that. And since then, I think aid has been taken off the table. I don't know if there is any development on that since then, but I know that aid has been stopped for the time being from the US.
Money and military have been taken off the table. And frankly, Starmer and the European leaders are just acting, I think, like a bunch of pussies. I mean, here's somebody who's trying to do the job that needed to be done a long time ago, which Obama and Biden simply couldn't/wouldn't do. And here are all these babies complaining.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call them babies. I do think that they are acting irresponsibly, but from a certain perspective, it does appear, and Donald Trump has been very, very clear with this, that US involvement with NATO may get pulled back if the European countries aren't able or willing to put in their funds, their adequate funds for NATO. And so there's this fear going around right now, and this has been echoed a number of times by people like Macron in a lengthy interview that he conducted with The Economist last year, that the worry is if the US pulls out of Europe, Europe has been, since the end of the Second World War, heavily reliant on the NATO alliance and on the US in particular to guarantee its security against a country like Russia. And of course, Vladimir Putin himself has been very, very clear at the beginning of the war what his war goals were. He wanted to get the ethnic Russians in Ukraine safe. He wanted to take those territories. He wanted access to the Black Sea, and he wanted to maintain Crimea, etc. But the worry for them is that if the US pulls out, they're going to be vulnerable. And I think to a certain perspective that is somewhat true, whether or not Putin is actually looking to take extra territory in the
Well,
EU.
well,
We have left ourselves very vulnerable. I mean, oh, sorry.
they couldn't do anything more than they're doing to make sure that that happens. I mean, it's just so obvious what the dynamics geopolitically of this are, and they're ignoring it completely. And I think it's very funny that, people from whom we Brexited have all run over here in fear to meet with Stammer and discuss all this. And what they say and what they resolve doesn't amount to a hill of beans because, frankly, they can't organize lunch, let alone a military operation on their own to protect Ukraine.
Well, of course, but they want to do their saber rattling and they want to talk big so that they can appear like they do have a seat at the table for peace negotiation talks and make sure that they can guarantee the safety. Of course, I do think for the time being,
and excuse me, and if they play nice, Trump will give them a seat at the table as long as they don't talk too much.
Well, yeah, I mean, the best guarantee for Ukrainian safety right now, I do think, would be the mineral deal, because as Trump has laid out, it would ensure that people are on the ground, US contractors, US figures are on the ground, ensuring that there's an economic benefit for them. Whereas with the European countries and the UK in particular, we have at the moment a very small and not capable military to be able to deploy out into Ukraine. Most of the other European countries, as JD Vance stated, there are some that haven't seen wars in 20 years. He was not referring, in fact, to England and France. He was simply referring to many of the other countries that are in Europe. They are deathly ill-equipped for a large-scale ground war. They've been more than happy to put in the monetary support and military support for equipment for Ukraine. But if we were to actually escalate it further, I think the last thing any of us want to see is an all-out ground war on Europe to re-emerge.
Yeah, you're right. Many people misunderstood and thought that Vance was talking about the UK, and they got all, how dare you insult the British Army? Quite right, but he wasn't.
No, and I think that was a really terrible move by the British media, because it really does seem to have been pushed by the British media. Yeah. And then you had a lot of conservative, Lib Dem, Labour MPs all repeating the same line as well, which I don't think is a great.
Sells papers.
It does sell papers, but I don't think it's great for diplomacy with a country that you're supposed to be allied alongside. Yeah. But either way, I think they are trying to recommit. Ursula von der Leyen stated that they were putting in 800 billion euros worth of commitment to rearmament. And that could be good for the future, because being British, I know we're Brexited from the EU and everything, but I do see the Europeans as my close cousins. Maybe not their governments, but the actual people. I want to see Europe strong. But the fact is that they're putting this money towards commitments again for military rearmament, whilst at the same time, in a country like Germany, we recently had another car attack in Mannheim where a man drove a car into a crowd of people and it killed a few people. And this is becoming such a common occurrence. It's on the daily now. And the governments are more than happy to commit to rearmament, all of this money that they're putting forward so that they can ensure that militarily Ukraine can be safe, so that they can push away the Russian menace, while they consistently, especially in a country like Germany, which has been terribly subject to a lot of Islamic terror, and hell, England, Britain has been as well, while they stand by and let that happen, and especially in England, criminalize you for complaining about it and criminalize you for trying to take a stand and protest about it, as happened in England in August of last year after the Southport murders.
Yeah, I mean, it's all down the rabbit hole. It's all Alice in Malice in Wonderland. It's all twisted because we need that money here for so many things. What in the world are they doing? And then Starmer comes out, uh, Zelensky's best friend, and there are questions around Zelensky as well, and it's just very strange that I think it's a publicity stunt. I think he
Well,
needed to.
there are other reasons that could be said to be why some of these people want to carry on the war, which could be just plain corruption. So
Sure.
Seymour Hersh, for instance, for a long time has been reporting on how the money that has been sent to Ukraine, quite a lot of it seems to have been skimmed off of the top. In fact, he pointed out all the way back in mid 2023 that he'd had reports from people on the inside that there were front companies being set up in places like the Czech Republic and within Poland, where they would act as some kind of front munitions or military company, and they would mainly just be skimming all of the money off the top. So I think we can't rule out just plain bare bones corruption
Oh, well,
in a lot of the motivation for these people wanting to carry on a war effort.
sure. I mean, there's been so much talk about that, and Zelensky's 15 homes and all the rest of it. There
Oh yeah.
must be something to all that. And
And then there was also everything to do with the Hunter Biden laptop or the deals that he was doing within Ukraine as well. So, I mean, ultimately, I do think that the people who've lost the most from this are the Ukrainian people, because the many Ukrainians themselves have been displaced. We had a
sure,
refugee scheme in this country. Many Ukrainians, I know the reports are, I've seen varying reports from different sources. I think Donald Trump's most recent statement was something like perhaps 700,000 Ukrainians have died in the
yeah.
fighting. And I just feel like it was completely unnecessary, because the initial peace talks that went on straight after the onset of the war back at the beginning of 2022. There was a very, very well written foreign affairs article discussing the whole thing, where peace talks were on the table. They were beginning negotiations. Russia was even willing, I don't think that they would have given it up, but they were willing to discuss the status of Crimea. And it was warmongers for Ukraine in the West, a lot of them like Boris Johnson and like the Biden administration, who pushed Zelensky into carrying on the war effort, which really has just meant that Ukraine has lost more of its territory and lost more of its lives. And I think that has been a complete waste of life and completely unnecessary.
Absolutely, absolutely. So who was it? Politics Joe, I think. They did some Vox Populi street interviews with young Brits, and they asked them if they would go to war as Britain for Ukraine. And I think one young fellow said, "What did he say? I would. I'm not sure I got the quote right, but I would serve crack before I would serve my country." I think he said. What do you make of that attitude, Harry? And would you fight for this country in its current state?
Certainly not in its current state. I think that is I think that's a feeling that's shared by many people on the ground in this country. Whether or not, if you were to
Young
ask
people
them in the,
or all sorts of people?
I would say young people, but I have seen many older people as well who are full on Ukraine war hawks when called up on this, saying, well, why don't you sign up? All saying, well, I'm too old to do it now. So when push comes to shove, these people aren't going to do anything to actually back up their stated positions. I've seen people in Canada talk about how important it is to fight back the Russians and beat them back from the territories that they've already captured, which is a complete pipe dream. It's not going to happen. So, in the
Never.
current state of the country, it's no wonder that people aren't willing to fight for it. It's a foreign conflict. When push comes to shove, people will see it as a foreign conflict. And there are two other factors in play here. One, which is that the actual indigenous British people of this country, the English, the Welsh, and the Scots, are ruled by a government that they see doesn't care about their interests and isn't doing anything to actively improve their lives. And so they say, why would I want to fight for that? And the other part of it is that there is a huge foreign population in this country, mainly made up of people from the Middle East and North Africa and elsewhere, who don't really, as much as they're willing to take it for their benefits, they don't really see this as their own country. So if push comes to shove, they'll go, well, I'm going to move home because this is a European conflict being fought by European people. I'm not European. I've got nothing to do with it. So if Keir Starmer was to try to escalate the war somehow, or the Europeans were trying to escalate the war, I think they would have a serious problem with just lack of willingness from all different parts of the population.
So let's assume that somehow, I don't know how, but the Labor Party decided that Starmer had to go. He was just too ineffectual and too wet and too untrusted and unreliable, whatever. And they made you prime minister. What would you do in Trumpian fashion, stepping in and acting quick? What would you do to make England great again?
Well, the first thing I would do is probably disband the Labour Party. Um, Secondly, I suppose regarding the Ukrainian effort, I would try to withdraw in as efficient and orderly as a way as possible our financial ties to Ukraine for the time being, and I would probably try to encourage them to sign the peace deal, or at least the ceasefire deal that's being brokered by the US at the moment. I think that's the best bet that they have for peace right now. Further, I would. There are a number of things that I would do. I would begin to implement a policy of remigration of foreign populations within this country, primarily regarding the illegals who are in this country, but then also people who are only claiming benefits, people who've come over and overstayed on their visas, people who've come alongside people as dependents on visas. There's so much abuse of the system. I would reform a lot of the border system. I would really beef up border control. I would try to potentially. I'm not an economist, so I don't necessarily know how this would happen. I would try to commit to some kind of rejuvenation project for the towns across this country, some kind of work scheme to try and get people back on their feet, which I think would be helped by the fact that, by cutting away most of the benefits and welfare system, which I think is a complete drag on this country, I think there would be more money to do such a thing.
So you
and,
would,
and of course, I would massively, massively, massively cut the civil service that exists within this country.
you do a Doge.
I think it's entirely necessary. I think one of the biggest problems in all liberal democratic governments that exist in the world right now are that they are incredibly bloated. They're no longer serving the people that they're supposed to represent. They're not even representing the national interests. They represent themselves. They're a law unto themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So you would disband the Labor Party. What would you do with the Tories and Lib Dems and Reform?
I'm not personally. I'm not a fan of party democratic politics as it is anyway. So I don't know. I would potentially want to reinstate some of the power of the monarchy, but I do not think that Charles is the king to reinstate that power to, mainly because of the fact that, he's shown himself to be aligned with the World Economic Forum. He's shown himself to be aligned with the global green agenda, net zero, and he mostly is a multicultural globalist leader. So I don't think that he would be the right monarch to reinvest a lot of power in, because I believe in the power of executive decision making, and I believe that the party politics of this country do need a massive reformation, mainly because Labour and the Tories are two sides of the same coin. Obviously, if I were to disband Labour, I think the Tories would go soon after, mainly because they're like parasites that feed off of one another. Other parties are welcome to emerge in whatever power vacuum that creates. And I do think that without those two acting as containment, then perhaps actual parties that care about the interests of the people could emerge. Not that I believe that, say, a party like the Lib Dems do, but the Lib Dems cater to a very, very specific demographic in this country. Reform would be welcome to stay and put themselves forwards, and perhaps we would see some positive change.
And William, if it weren't Charles?
William, I don't know enough about on a personal level. He does great public appearances, and he has a fantastic PR team. Clearly, him and Kate in particular. But I don't know enough about his personal beliefs. Perhaps he'll be the king that was promised. But Charles, for as much as I respect the position of the monarch in this country, I'm not a huge fan of Charles.
Right. So you basically disregard the actual political parties, and you could issue executive orders like Trump and change all these bad things.
In an ideal world, yes.
And what would you do about Gaza?
Um, I'm personally not invested all that much about the Israel Gaza conflict. I would like for the pro Palestinian marches that happen in our cities every single week to end. I would like for the people who commit to those protests to put their money where their mouth is. Personally, I have no issue with the state of Israel defending itself.
And what about our economy? Because at the end of the day, Gaza, Ukraine, political parties, I mean, there's a lot of people who really don't give a damn. What really
Mm.
matters, as Bill Clinton said many years ago, it's the economy, stupid, is when people are in the voting booth, it's what's going to be in their pocket, isn't it? And the economy is really in a dire state. I mean, the numbers and the figures, you get all kinds of them all over the place. But basically, our problem is that we haven't had growth in decades. We haven't reinvested in decades. Some figures say that had we reinvested since the early 90s when the growth stopped, we wouldn't have a deficit, if indeed we do have a deficit. We would have something like 2 trillion in the bank from just normal growth every year since then. Um, what would you do about the lack of productivity and excess of red tape and everything else that governments, just by their nature, seem to do to business and economies and economic growth?
Well, of course, I'm no economist myself, so in
Thank
formulating
thank goodness.
and in formulating how this would work, I would of course consult experts who actually know how they would be able to push these changes through. But I would do what is possible to again cut back on the civil service, cut back on some of the regulations that are absolutely crippling the economy. I would change the council rules in a lot of the places because a lot of the councils across the country have a certain bias and preference to accepting in illegal migrants into their towns. And I do think that the presence of hostile foreign populations, if you have a migrant hotel, deters people from investing in the future. There's a
Yeah,
lot of this. There's a lot of this country's problems that is to do with the government reinforcing behaviours that lead to short-termism, short-term thinking. If people see that their demographics around them are changing constantly, if people see that their local community isn't as stable as it was, if they don't know what's coming tomorrow, they'll invest purely in today. Whereas if we can create a more stable community for people, if we can make it so that they're not necessarily certain, so they're not worried that the hotel next door or across the road from your school is suddenly going to be taken over with no notice
yeah.
from the council at all, with people who are going to start following your daughter down the road once she's finished school. People will then be able to invest in their communities again. As well as that, I also do think that the NHS is just an absolute money black hole in this country. So much of it is a complete waste. Anybody who has used the NHS recently will be able to tell you that it is a nightmare to get anything done. I had a friend just the other day who might have suffered I think she was spiked on a night out, and she might have also suffered a concussion as well. She was feeling terrible, terrible side effects from it. She goes to an NHS A&E room, and she's waiting there for 6 hours when she could have serious problems. And she was told that she might be waiting another six. So in situations like that, people give up. There's
Yeah.
so much in this country that is seemingly dedicated, purpose built to making people give up on their dreams, give up on their future. So it's no wonder that a lot of young people are seeing opportunity elsewhere. But if we
Mm.
were to roll a lot of that back, create an environment that people can have hope for the future in, people will start investing in their communities again.
Yeah.
They'll start to
Yeah.
invest in their local businesses.
NHS really is a black hole. I have Harley Street consultant friends who are always giving me examples of how their talent is ignored and how the work they could do is wasted and how it's programmed for inefficiency in some ways. It's also when you have a serious problem, it's the best in the world. But when it's less serious stuff, it's pretty bad. Tell me, how does your successful podcast, the Lotus Eaters, how does that help to bring forth all the things you're talking about?
Well, I like to think that we make a difference by shining a light on a lot of these issues. Particularly, I mean, in reference to the NHS thing, we've done a lot of coverage on the NHS, looking into it. And there's an account, a very interesting account on Twitter called Days of NHS Spending, that we've referred to quite a lot, where it takes the cost of a particular thing, say the coronation last year, and sorry, no, 2 years ago, and calculates how much that costs in days of NHS spending. I think the coronation cost like a third of a days of NHS spending, because the
Yeah,
actual cost of that is about £550 million per day,
yeah, yeah,
over
yeah.
£500 million per day for a service that is completely not fit for use.
Not fit for
And I
purpose.
like to think that when we make people aware of that, we inform them. We can inform them in their political decisions if they're going and voting. But also, I think on a more intimate basis, I think being better informed allows you to navigate the world better. And so, if
Yeah,
you know that there are certain problems, even in certain towns, or if you know that there are certain populations that maybe commit crime a bit more. It allows you to inform your decision making on the day to day better than you would if you were kept in the dark about it, which is what a lot of the mainstream media likes to do. It likes to keep people in the dark about the situations that they could face day to day. And in this way, I think actively endanger a lot of these people through
yeah,
that negligence. And
yeah.
similarly, as well, I think knowledge and being informed for its own sake is a virtue.
Very valuable. Very valuable. When I was your age, people used to ask, "Do you enjoy sex?" Now today, it's how many followers do you have?
How many followers do I have? I
Does the
have,
podcast have?
oh, on the podcast, I believe last time, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I think on the website, we have a subscriber function. So we have quite a few thousand people subscribed to the website who are supporting us day in, day out. And we really, really appreciate everything from them. On the YouTube channel, we've got a few YouTube channels. We've got the podcast, the Lotus Eaters channel, which I think has 400,000 subscribers on it. Last
Wow.
time I checked, oftentimes our videos will exceed that. I did a video in November that was looking into the case history of Keir Starmer, his track record as a human rights lawyer, trying to get the death penalty banned in the Caribbean, for instance, on behalf of a child murderer, because he wanted to make sure that the child murderer didn't hang, because he was a very, very virtuous man, Keir Starmer. That got, I think, almost 500,000 views. And we also have recently started a daily channel called Lotus Eaters Daily. We do shorter non-podcast clips talking about a specific subject. So earlier on, I went on there and spoke about an ongoing bit of discourse that keeps popping up over whether Rishi Sunak is English, because that's been a bit of discourse recently. I think my answer is very simple: is that he is an Indian Hindu, and I don't think there's any shame or anything wrong with that. And trying to say that you could say that he's nationally British, ethnically English, I said no. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I don't understand what the pushback is. A ridiculous conversation. But these are the sorts of things that we can talk about. Josh has spoken about a number of things. That's the sort of thing
Yeah.
that if we find something that's worth a smaller video and talking about directly to the camera, we do on that. And I think that's got 50,000 subscribers now, maybe 40 to 50,000. So it's growing quite quickly for a very
Very
new
good. That's a
channel.
lot. That's a lot of subscribers. Yeah, you never can tell how these things are going to pop up. Strangely enough, I did a program on with Alex, my friend Alex Phillips,
Oh,
on
yes.
Talk. I did a program where I criticized the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics, and we got 1,000,002 views. I don't know why, but
Hey, congratulations. Sometimes they really do just pop up
yeah,
for you
yeah.
out of nowhere. I
I
always am
never
very
would have
grateful when that
I never
happens.
would have imagined that. Yeah, yeah. So you never know. Good. Well, Is there anything else you want to talk about or anything you want to ask me?
Do you
When you're your age, when you're my age, by the way, you'll be able to call the European leaders babies.
I'm sure I will. Thank you. Do you think that the likelihood is that Zelensky will sign a minerals deal with the US soon? Because I've been looking into that, and after the aid has been cut from them for the very short time that it has been, it seems that Zelensky is very, very eager to come back to the table because no matter the financial commitments that the rest of Europe wants to give to him, I think he knows that most of the rest of Europe is in no position to guarantee the kind of security that the US is. Do you think that that's going to happen?
I said almost immediately after the White House meeting, debacle, whatever you want to call it, um, that Trump is right. Zelensky holds no cards. Europe is a bust deck. And I don't think they'll come up with much of anything except a lot of talk and a lot of hot air. And as I say, they have trouble agreeing on lunch. And so I don't think they'll give him anything. And I said almost immediately afterwards that he would be back like a flash because if he doesn't realize it, his handlers will make him understand that his behavior in the sanctum sanctorum, the principal sanctum sanctorum of the world's most powerful nation to the most powerful man in the world and his alter ego was the most stupidly unstrategic thing he could do. And who the hell did he think he was anyway? And he would be back in a flash. And that's what happened. And Trump is upping the ante by stopping the monetary and the military aid. And of course, he's going to come back and sign the minerals deal for two reasons, one of which you said. The first is that the minerals are actually in the Russian-controlled eastern part of the country. So there needs to be a ceasefire to even start that. And then secondly, as you observed, there are going to be American operatives there for years. So there couldn't possibly be a Russian invasion. It's a stroke of genius. And any president, there hasn't really been a president who was a businessman since Harry Truman, and now Trump. Any businessman president would have made a deal like this. It's a no-brainer, years ago. We give you aid, you give us something. But most of these people, like Obama, who'd give the Iranians whatever they want just to his legacy and get a Nobel Prize, wouldn't even think to do that. So yeah, of course they'll sign the minerals deal. And it may not be Zelensky. He may step down. I mean, he was arrogant enough the other day to say, I will step down provided we join NATO. In other words, let's poke the Russian bear big time. Let's go against what I was just told in the Oval Office, and then I'll step down. I mean, unbelievable arrogance. So that's not going to happen. But he could conceivably still step down, and it might be somebody else. But yeah, Ukraine will sign a peace deal. Henry Kissinger was right over more than a year ago when he said all this is what needed to happen, but nobody was listening.
Yeah, so certainly I can hope that that would be the most sensible and sane approach to coming to peace. Whatever stops the violence as soon as possible is what I'm in favor of.
Yeah,
I will be interested to see in the peace deal, seeing as you rightly pointed out, most of the minerals, certainly the high value minerals, are currently in the territories that Russia are occupying. What the agreement to that would be, whether Russia would be granted some kind of administrative sovereignty over the territories whilst allowing the US contractors to come in to conduct their work. I'd be very interested to see how this
those
ends
are
up.
details.
And I also would be very surprised if Zelensky manages to outlast the end of this conflict. That could be another thing pushing him
Yeah,
forward, is that he knows as soon as
these
it's
are
done, he's
details.
out.
These are details that will be worked out, but uh, the principle is there. So I think that I think we will see peace soon, and I think he will then go on to do the same thing in the Middle East. I think he
Well, I can
will.
only hope so. I can
I
only
think
hope so because Donald Trump has, all the way back from 2015, been a very anti-war candidate
he
from
is.
my understanding of
He
it.
he
So if
but
he can hold himself up to that standard, I'd be very grateful to see an end to some of the major conflicts that we see in the world right now.
he's a very charming man who believes in
making a deal and settling things on a win-win basis, as opposed to, I mean, he's a very tough, rough New York property magnate, but he does like win-win deals, thus, North Korea and all the rest of it. So, Harry, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. You're a very articulate chap, and you've got some very good thoughts, and it's been great having you. And if we may, we'd love to have you back again sometime.
Well, if there's ever a time, Roger, let me know. And thank you very, very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.